Good evening and welcome to St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander, and this is our walking tour through the Bible, step 129. And we've been speeding up recently. I know we did Judith in one big leap, and I'm proposing to do Esther in one big leap. The Book of Esther does appear in the breviary in a truncated form. If you actually read it through, which won't take you very long, take about 15 minutes, it's 10 chapters. It's a very simple story. There's a king called Ahasuerus, who's actually Xerxes, who has a wife, and called Vashti. He summons her so he can show off her beauty. She refuses to turn up, quite rightly, modern people might think. He decides he must get rid of her because this sort of behavior cannot be tolerated. Otherwise, every wife in the Persian Empire will start rebelling. Anyway, off she goes. And he then, of course, has a vacancy. And so there's sort of this competition to find him a new wife. And it's won by a girl called Esther, who's very, very beautiful, who just happens to be Jewish, but keeps her Judaism secret. The way Esther is sort of taken into the palace and the way she flourishes in the palace recalls several Oriental stories. I mean, I always think when I read this about Scheherazade, if you remember, who was the wife who was going to be executed, but told these wonderful stories and therefore preserved her life. But I'm also thinking about Chixi, now who's Chixi, otherwise Zuxi, who was a girl who was taken into the palace of the Emperor of China as just a mere concubine and eventually rose to be Dowager Empress and ruler of China for a great part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. These things did happen. You did get very powerful women in harems, and the harem is actually mentioned here, the women's quarters of the palace. One thinks naturally of the Buyuk Valide Sultan, that is to say, the great Queen Mother in the Turkish court, who was ruled through her son and eventually through her grandson, the so-called Sultanate of the Women. Eventually, of course, they had to get rid of her. And of course, one thinks of the great mother of the Abdulaziz in the early part of the 20th century, Perteneval. Also think too of the great wife of the Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent in Turkey, Roxelani, as we call her in the East. In the West, sorry. She was called something else in the East, who was probably the daughter of a priest and was originally a Christian. Anyway, these sort of powerful women and these harem intrigues, this is the stuff of which fairy tales are made. And of course, Esther is a fairy tale because Esther never existed and Vashti never existed. Xerxes certainly existed. Esther, Vashti, and indeed Mordecai never existed. Now, the story is a very simple one. She becomes queen. Then this evil Haman decides that he's going to have all the Jews massacred, and Xerxes, as Ahasuerus, who seems quite a nice guy, said, yeah, sure, you can do it. Then Mordecai, her cousin, who gets wind of this, then appeals to Esther and tells her for this very reason she may have become queen, to save the Jewish people. So the Jews in Susa fast, Esther fasts, then she goes to the king, and by a long sort of complicated story, the tables are turned. Haman, who has plotted the destruction of the Jews, is himself hanged, and all the people who have been plotting the destruction of the Jews are themselves massacred. And 75,000 of them altogether, we're told, which is rather bloodthirsty. So there is a complete bouleversement, which the author wants to make clear to us is brought about through the providence of God. So Esther, who makes this magnificent prayer in the middle of the book, who says, I loathe the bed of the uncircumcised. I never wear my crown on my days off. I loathe it. But she says to God, please, please give me the strength to appear before the king and to turn this situation around. And that's what happens. A Jewish friend once explained the Feast of Purim to me. It goes like this. They tried to kill us. We killed them. Let's eat. Now, at the end of the book, it says that this tale of Esther is the foundation of the Book of Purim. Sorry, the Feast of Purim. Now, the Feast of Purim is still celebrated today. The Feast of Purim is when little Jewish girls and boys all dress up, usually as spacemen or something like that, and go parading through the streets. It's the Jewish carnival, and great fun it looks. Not quite clear how Purim is somehow or another connected to Esther. Now, it's true, Haman draws the lot, the the Purim is the plural of lots, and that gives us a hook to the Feast of Purim. My guess is that the Feast of Purim has some other origin, and that this tale of Esther was written to provide an origin for the Feast of Purim. In other words, it's an etiology. People are saying, well, here we are celebrating this Feast of Purim, but why? What's the origin of this feast? Nobody knew, but somebody came up with this, the story of Esther. The Feast of Purim, it says, is to be celebrated all the time wherever the Jews are. And indeed, it still is, which is a wonderful thing. Now, the thing about this book is well, it's a fairy story. Its style is very much of the fairy story. Its style is that of Bluebeard's castle. If you notice, the king Ahasuerus doesn't seem to have any real human motivation. Neither does the evil Haman. The evil Haman has got a grudge against the Jews because Mordecai has slighted him. Seems rather a small provocation for such a huge massacre, but there you go. And Ahasuerus plans this massacre, or consents this massacre quite happily, and then sort of consents to the counter massacre quite happily as well. One of the things about the Book of Esther, which sticks with us, I think, today, is that we read this book in the light of the Holocaust. In other words, Haman says these Jews, they're not integrated into the empire, therefore they must all be killed. They have strange customs, strange ways. They're not like us. They are other, therefore they must all be killed. And he actually specifies men, women, and children, which is quite horrific when you think about it. And of course, this is exactly what happened in the time of the Holocaust. After the Wannsee Conference, having persecuted the Jews, the Nazis decided they would actually exterminate the Jews. They just went one further and decided on the so-called final solution. We read the Book of Esther as a fairy tale, and don't forget, fairy tales traditionally have lots of really horrific, bloody things in them. Even modern fairy tales like James and the Giant Peach, if you remember that. Aunt Spiker and Aunt Sponge come to a horrible end, but you're not supposed to feel sorry for them. And there are many, many fairy tales in which horrible things happen to people. We can't really take this very seriously as a fairy tale because it's a little bit too close to what actually happened in history. And of course, the murder of 6 million Jews by a diseased mind and its collaborators, just as horrible as Haman, and of course, all the people who collaborated with Haman. So there is a nasty existential question hanging over this. Why was Haman so evil? Why did he take against the Jews? And why did so many people cooperate with Haman? Why did nobody stand up for the Jews in the Book of Esther and say, hey, this idea of massacring a whole race is completely wrong? Why didn't Ahasuerus say, excuse me, you want me to murder my own subjects? Are you mad? He doesn't say that. So it's a little bit strange, isn't it? Anyway, I don't know when Purim is this year, but let's hope everybody has a great and happy celebration. Incidentally, Esther is a Jewish heroine to this day. Hadassah, Esther, it's a popular name amongst Hebrew-speaking friends. And this is, again, like Judith, and indeed like Tobit. Tobit, of course, is different because we love Tobit because of its theology of marriage. But this one, of course, is a nationalistic tale. It's you can't take on the Jews. If you do try and take on the Jews, you'll live to regret it. Okay, so moving swiftly on, we'll go on to our next book next time. All the very best.